offered them a free trip to Florida. The impressionable teenage girls agreed to go with the stepbrothers and didn't ask a lot of questions.
The girls told us that they weren't aware that there'd been a homicide, and they weren't really aware that there'd been a bank robbery as such, but they were aware that something had happened to allow McMahon and Kaufman to have so much money.
The girls told investigators that on their way out of town, they stopped by the Des Moines River. One of the stepbrothers threw a duffel bag into the water, but he never told them what was inside. After that, the four of them drove south toward Florida.
For the first week of this trip with McMahon and Kaufman, the girls treated it like it was a vacation. They were having a good time. They were eating out. They were going to amusement parks.
One of their first stops was in Branson, Missouri. There, the four entertained themselves on carnival rides. The girls said they took photos along the way.
They had with them a couple of Instamatic cameras, and we took those cameras and had the film developed, and we had photographs of McMahon and Kaufman, and one picture in particular is of Chris Kaufman sitting in Barb Garber's pickup truck.
After their trip to Disney World, the girls said that McMahon and Kaufman finally confessed to them about the murders and the bank robbery. Kaufman had dyed his hair blonde to disguise himself. High on methamphetamine, the armed men also told the girls they wouldn't mind killing them as well. The girls were frightened and told the fugitives they wanted to return home.
All right, look, here.
McMahon gave them money for a taxi and train fare back to Iowa.
Get y'all back home.
They told investigators they had no idea where the stepbrothers were headed.
Well, they didn't say where they were going. They just gave us money and we left.
Investigators concluded the girls were not involved since they remained at the Oskaloosa Motel when the crimes had occurred. They released the teenagers into their parents' custody without filing charges. On the Des Moines River, an off-duty Iowa trooper happened to come across a bag in the water. He opened it to find a pair of black ski masks and brown coveralls. The officer also found a wallet with a driver's license. He contacted police and gave them the evidence. The wallet and driver's license belonged to the murdered Island Schultz. The clothing matched what the robbers were wearing when they made off with $65,000 in cash from an Iowa bank. Jamie McMahon and Christopher Kaufman remained the prime suspects, and they were still out there, armed and strung out. On June 30th, 1997, 19 days after the search for McMahon and Kaufman began, a call came into the Escambia County Sheriff's Department in Florida. A motorist in Pensacola wanted to talk to police.
Everybody involved in this that you can, okay?
He told them he was driving on a nearby highway when he noticed a green pickup. The night before, he had seen a story about the manhunt for McMahon and Kaufman on television. The truck seemed to fit the description of the fugitive's vehicle. The motorist pulled alongside to get a closer look. He thought the driver looked exactly like the man featured on the show. The truck also had Iowa tags. The motorist pulled off and phoned police.
South, east, and west of
The Escambia County Sheriff's Department realized the motorist's description of the truck matched the one Iowa authorities were looking for.
compass out there.
Iowa authorities wanted to be sure this wasn't just another false lead. It seemed promising, since the suspected murderers were last seen in Florida. They confirmed the license number and sent photos of the stepbrothers to the sheriffs in Pensacola.
That's the same guy I'm thinking of.
Iowa investigators alerted them to use caution, since the fugitive pair were considered armed and dangerous.
Pick up something and come back over here. Need to set a roadblock around Pensacola and all surrounding counties.
An urgent be on the lookout was issued for the green truck in the Pensacola area. Deputies searched local roads, shopping centers, and motel parking lots for any sign of the fugitives or the stolen green pickup truck. In the parking lot of a local motel, 2 officers spotted a green pickup truck. Motel residents usually park close to their room entrance, but this vehicle was obscured near the back behind a fence. Its Iowa license plate and description checked out. It was the murder victim's stolen truck from Iowa. Authorities had no time to lose if they hoped to bring in the fugitives before they eluded them once again. At a Pensacola, Florida motel, authorities had finally located the stolen pickup truck driven by Jamie McMahon and Christopher Kaufman, stepbrothers suspected of 2 murders and a bank robbery in Iowa. Escambia County deputies needed to confirm if the armed fugitives were staying there.
I know if you've seen these gentlemen today, people, man.
Yes.
The motel
they're
clerk
both-
recognized the photos of McMahon and Kaufman, but she added that there was a 3rd man in their room. She gave deputies the room number.
Possibly a hostage situation.
Police told her the motel had to be evacuated.
Yes, no problem.
Okay, I'll go with you.
Fearing that the stepbrothers had possibly taken a hostage, deputies called in a hostage negotiating team.
We know they've killed 2 already.
Escambia County Sheriff Sergeant Jerry Cox was in charge.
We want to establish a command post in this area. That's where we're going.
We knew they were armed. We knew that they were murder suspects. We knew they were bank robbers. They were seriously violent criminal individuals. So we got the call out. Our SWAT team and crisis negotiators got the call out, and we responded to the motel.
The motel was evacuated. The hostage negotiating team set up an emergency center nearby. SWAT teams took up positions near McMahon and Kaufman's room. Snipers set up on a nearby roof. No one knew the situation with the 3rd man or his relationship with the stepbrothers. They had no way of knowing if they were all still inside. The negotiators secured the line and attempted to get them on the phone.
Okay, we got the line.
From the man's tone of voice, the negotiator believed he was likely a hostage.
When I made contact with the room, the first individual that I talked to was the hostage himself. He gave me a false name, and I began to try to talk to him a little bit, knowing that was not the correct name, of course, and try to find out what his situation was, what his physical condition was, and what the situation was in the room.
The man said he had just met the fugitives hitchhiking and stayed with them to party for a while. The stepbrothers had been awake for almost 4 days, high on meth, and now they were finally crashing.
There's no way. They'll shoot.
The man had since become aware they were murder suspects and that they were still armed.
In and out of sleep, whacked out.
He was absolutely frightened out of his mind. He did not know what to do, and he knew that they were willing to take life. They had made statements to him that they would not be taken alive. and therefore he was afraid to make any moves because of what they might do to him.
Bobby?
The
Bobby, how many
negotiator
people
tried
are
to
up there
convince
with
him to
you?
leave the room,
There's two other guys.
that the rescue
What's their
team would be
condition?
at the door when he emerged. While the man considered what to do,
They got a gun,
McMahon
they're
woke
doing
up.
meth all night. Well, yeah, one of them's getting up.
Who's on the phone, man?
It's the cops, man. You guys gotta let me out of here.
One of my major concerns was the fact that they were known drug users and had been partying for a number of days. When people are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, when it comes to negotiations, one of the things you have to be aware of is how those chemicals can alter a person's personality and alter their
let us
reactions.
parley.
They might be extremely aggressive.
Come back
Due to
anytime.
their 3-week drug binge, it became clear to the negotiator that the fugitives were not thinking clearly, if at all.
Talking to the cops for?
Do
Calm down, man.
check back.
Whoa, calm down. Here.
His first concern was to get the third man out safely without more bloodshed. Authorities were all too aware that the situation could turn violent quickly.
Paramount in my mind was the fact that if they killed two already, and both those murders, based on my information, were cold-blooded, calculated murders with no thought given whatsoever to the consequences, that they could easily do that again.
Hold on. Shoot everybody. Calm down. Just sit down. Calm down, man. Just hold on. No, man. Put that away. Put that away, man.
Who is this?
Chill. Calm down, man. Just hold on.
Sharpshooters stood at the ready. The negotiator tried to convince them to let the man out of the room before someone else was killed.
Shouldn't have done that, man. Man, what do you want? There's no. I'm out. No way, man.
Just gonna walk out?
There's no way.
All right, fine. You don't mean no crap to us. Man, Chris, let him go. Man.
After 2 hours, the armed men finally allowed him to leave unharmed. SWAT members spirited the hostage out of the line of fire to where the negotiators continued to work. The hostage said he met the fugitives in New Orleans and had been with them for several days. He said they had a lot of drugs and a lot of cash in the room.
Somebody a couple days.
They only had one handgun as far as he knew.
I guess.
With 2 armed fugitives still barricaded in the motel room, a peaceful resolution did not seem likely. In June of 1997, hostage negotiators and a SWAT team surrounded a Pensacola, Florida motel where 2 armed fugitives wanted for 2 murders and a bank heist in Iowa remained barricaded inside their room, strung out on drugs. Escambia County Sheriff Sergeant Jerry Cox was the lead negotiator.
It's the most difficult segment of the negotiations for me, was to try to overcome the emotional state that they were in as a result of their drug use, their prolonged activity of being awake for so long, and to try to direct them in a peaceful resolution.
He spoke to 18-year-old Christopher Kaufman for some time.
It's Chris. We didn't kill everybody.
The young fugitive was aware that he was surrounded by police. Sergeant Cox tried to convince him to do the sensible thing and come out unarmed.
But one of the things I was able to learn from Kaufman was that he was tired, that he was just too physically and mentally exhausted to be making an awful lot of decisions.
Worn out, Kaufman passed the phone to his 22-year-old stepbrother, Jamie McMahon.
What?
The negotiator noticed that McMahon seemed more lucid, more mature than his younger brother. He used it as a hook to separate the two.
So I told him, I said, it's obvious to me that you're the one who's running the show in there. I need you to take charge and do something for me. And he said, what is that? And I said, well, what I need you to do is I need you to take care of your brother. I need you to get him out of there.
Look, just go.
The strategy worked.
Just go. I started this. Let me finish. Chris, man, I just want you to go.
McMahon didn't want his brother to suffer whatever consequences McMahon was going to face by staying in the room.
Go.
SWAT members secured Christopher Kaufman. Now, only his stepbrother remained. McMahon teetered between indecision and despair. He knew his options were limited. The 22-year-old began to weigh life in prison versus suicide.
I heard what sounded to me like a weapon being charged. It was an automatic pistol that he had in there, so it sounded like somebody had slid the slide back and ejected a shell into the chamber, arming the weapon for firing. Gave me some concern. I passed that information on to our commanders and our SWAT team.
McMahon's judgment was clouded.
You there?
He didn't want to spend the rest of his life behind bars.
No, man.
Confused and desperate, he looked to the negotiator for guidance.
And the thing that seemed to work the most was constantly reminding him that as long as he was alive, he had some hope. He had a chance. Once he was dead, there was no chance. And that in Iowa, there was no death penalty. He had an awful lot of years ahead of him to figure this out.
McMahon relented to the negotiator's insight. 4 hours after it had begun, the last fugitive walked out of the room, unarmed as instructed. The negotiator was able to defuse the situation without death or injury. Agents secured and searched the motel room. They recovered $29,000 in cash of the $65,000 that was stolen. They also found the .22 semi-automatic handgun. On every table rested empty beer bottles, marijuana, and powdered methamphetamine. Ballistics tests later confirmed that .22 was the weapon used to kill the 2 women in Iowa. Authorities questioned the pair separately.
I understand from your brother that you committed both of the murders.
No. One of the...
Kaufman told investigators it was his stepbrother's idea to rob the bank. To pull off the heist, they needed a car. McMahon already had his eye on the first victim's pickup truck, the truck he initially wanted to use as the getaway vehicle.
think I may have left it at a different friend's house. You mind if I use your phone real quick?
Mrs. Garber knew McMahon and allowed the brothers into her house.
Man, just put the phone right back down, please. Shut up, man. Just sit down right there. Sit down. Just sit down!
Once inside, Kaufman claimed his stepbrother egged him on to kill her.
Just do it! All right, do it!
He wanted Mrs. Garber dead so she wouldn't report the vehicle missing. Kaufman said he shot Barbara Garber twice, then again to make sure she was dead. Since McMahon loved her truck so much, he wanted to keep it and steal a different vehicle to use in the robbery. McMahon decided to try another friend of his, Island Schultz.
Hey.
Like Mrs. Garber, their second victim let McMahon in along with Kaufman. The pair claimed they needed money for gas. She lent them $5.
That's fun. For now. Yeah.
As she bent over to put a music tape on, Kaufman told investigators his stepbrother shot her in the back of the head. To make sure she was dead, McMahon shot her again between the eyes. The stepbrothers took Schultz's car keys and wallet. Over the next 3 weeks, the pair spent $36,000 on hotels, prostitutes, and drugs before they were apprehended in Pensacola, Florida. Though Iowa had no death penalty, Jamie McMahon, 22, and Christopher Kaufman, 18, faced the federal death penalty for 2 carjackings resulting in death. They faced another federal charge for bank robbery. To avoid a death sentence, the stepbrothers pled guilty to all federal and state charges. Their convictions left many unanswered questions for the people of Iowa and Mahaska County Chief Deputy Paul DeGeest.
These 2 guys were as common as any 2 boys next door. I can't explain why they would go to this extent to get a vehicle and to go on vacation or just to impress a couple of girls. It's just crazy. You'd never guess that they would be the 2 type of individuals to do that, knowing their parents, knowing their backgrounds. I mean, it just didn't make sense.
Jamie McMahon serves the rest of his life in Leavenworth, Kansas. Christopher Kaufman serves his time in solitary confinement in the tough Supermax federal prison in Florence, Colorado. In the late 80s, Florida's cocaine imports were among the highest in the nation. Regional territories were enforced with intimidation and murder. One dealer bowed to no one, not even law enforcement. Desperate to stop the violence, authorities turned to the FBI for help.
suspected drug dealer would stop at nothing to keep local and federal authorities from building a case against him. When his organization started targeting the government itself, federal agencies went on high alert. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. He was a desperate man, driven to desperate measures. Bringing him down would take the combined efforts of the DEA, the ATF, and the FBI.
Fort Myers Beach, Florida, July 18th, 1987. It was a Saturday night in a Gulf Coast beach town with a thriving nightlife and a booming drug trade. Away from the tourists, many local residents spent the weekend at private parties. For some, that included cocaine. At one party, several men waited for their friend to return with more drugs. He'd been gone for about a half an hour when they heard what sounded like gunshots at around 10 p.m. The owner of the car, whose vehicle was used for the drug run, saw that it was now parked out front. Inside, he found his friend shot to death. The Lee County Sheriff's Department responded to the scene. A forensic technician found only one identifiable fingerprint on the car. It belonged to the vehicle's owner. Lying close to the driver's door were 7 empty .22 caliber shell casings. Investigators determined the victim had been shot at close range. An autopsy would reveal 8 bullet wounds in his upper body and traces of cocaine in his bloodstream. The owner of the car said the dead man was his friend, 29-year-old Craig Karen. Reluctantly, he told homicide detectives that the victim had left earlier to buy cocaine. The victim's girlfriend suggested police should question her boyfriend's cocaine dealer. He owed the dealer money for drugs. The dealer had a reputation for violence. Lee County homicide detective Tom Continos learned the dealer's name was Jeff Saganek.
Jeff is a young kid from Fort Myers Beach who had established himself as what I thought to be a mid-level drug dealer on the beach. Through talking to Craig's associates, I learned that Craig owed Jeff a large amount of money. And the reputation was that you better pay your bills with Jeff or he's going to send someone to collect it.
The next day, an unexpected visitor appeared at the Lee County Sheriff's Department. It was the alleged cocaine dealer himself, 23-year-old Jeff Saganek. He asked to see the detective investigating the previous night's killing. He wanted to give a statement. The reputed dealer, with a history of arrests, heard he might be a suspect and wanted to set the record straight. On the night of the murder, Jeff Saganek claimed that he and his girlfriend were at a restaurant for a late dinner. He said that he had talked to the victim in the parking lot just before the couple sat down to eat. After a few minutes, the man left. The reputed dealer said he and his girlfriend were at the restaurant from about 9:45 until 11 p.m. And he had more to offer than his word. Jeff Saganek handed the detective his restaurant receipt. The waitress who served them confirmed the story. It appeared he had an airtight alibi. But to the seasoned detective, it seemed Jeff Saganek was trying too hard to cover his tracks.
I had investigated enough homicides to see all different types of suspects and how they react and the reasons why they commit murder. For this young kid to come in, as well organized as he was, with an alibi, with witnesses, with receipts, he became my #1 suspect.
On a tip, the detective questioned a member of a local rock band who was also known to deal cocaine. He admitted that the victim sometimes bought drugs from him directly, which made Jeff Saganek, allegedly the largest dealer on the beach, angry over the lost sales. At about 11:15 on the night of the murder, Jeff Saganek came to the lounge where he was playing. According to the performer, Jeff Saganek boasted that he had just had the victim wasted and that it would teach the people of Fort Myers Beach a lesson. The musician's story was one of many over the next several months that confirmed what police already suspected. But even in the underworld of Fort Myers Beach, rumors and innuendo were not evidence of murder.
Everything that I got was hearsay. No one would really give me sworn testimony that says, I saw this, or I saw that, or I know this and I know that. It was all he said, she said type of intelligence information, which is maybe okay for drug cases, but not with murder investigations. You need sworn testimony of people who actually saw something happen.
Then, in the summer of 1988, over a year after the murder, the detective finally got a break. A young woman came forward, claiming to have witnessed the killing. She had not spoken up sooner because she was addicted to drugs and was protecting her former supplier, Jeff Saganek. Now she was clean and wanted to tell detectives what she had seen on the night of July 18th, 1987. She was on her way to the cocaine party that evening when she witnessed the shooting. The gunman was her former boyfriend, a man who worked for Jeff Saganek. But the detective would be unable to speak to her boyfriend directly. Just a few months after the murder, her boyfriend had committed suicide. She told police that she also had direct knowledge about Jeff Saganek and his organization. The woman said Jeff and his right-hand man operated out of a local pizza parlor that Saganek owned. The dealer stored his drugs and money at several different locations and moved between them to avoid detection. Few people knew where he actually lived. Jeff Saganek had many people on his payroll, but she knew only a handful. Her former boyfriend was one of them, hired by Jeff Saganek to do whatever the dealer needed done. She and Jeff had also had an arrangement. In exchange for storing drugs and guns at her apartment, Jeff had paid her rent. Unable to corroborate her story with other testimony or physical evidence, the detective could not charge Jeff Saganek with the murder.
I followed up on those leads, and I was not able to substantiate any of the information that she gave me at that point. So without the trigger man, without a gun, without eyewitness testimony, I couldn't get to Jeff. I couldn't get to Jeff. I had no physical evidence, no testimonial evidence that enabled me to bring charges against Jeff. The
homicide detective looked to the Lee County Narcotics Unit for help. Detectives began surveillance on Jeff Saganic's pizza parlor, hoping to identify someone they could turn against the dealer. The place was a popular spot. It would take time for officers to discern the drug traffickers from the legitimate customers. To complicate matters, Jeff Saganic changed his name legally to Jeff Matthews, presumably to sever ties to his past crimes.
Jeff was the type of person where he wanted to be a clean-cut businessman. Jeff even went to the point of changing his name from Jeff Saganik to Jeff Matthews to try and help him with his reputation.
Over several weeks, investigators noted which people frequented Jeff Matthews' place without picking up any food. Investigators spotted one man who visited often. A license plate check revealed his name was Stephen Franken. Detectives speculated that Franken might be their connection to Jeff Matthews. Investigators called DEA Special Agent Dennis Bolam, who was already familiar with Stephen Franken. Agents believed Franken was a low-level cocaine dealer who procured his supply from Jeff Matthews, but they had no proof. To link the two men, Agent Bolam hoped to use an informant close to Franken.
I received some information from a cooperating source that Mr. Franken was distributing cocaine out of his house on Hibiscus Street in Fort Myers Beach, and that he was distributing to quite a few people down at the Fort Myers Beach area.
Their informant, recently arrested for possession, was one of Stephen Franken's biggest customers. For his cooperation in controlled drug buys from Franken, the informant would receive probation. If the purchases were successful, agents would be able to arrest Franken, then press him for direct testimony about Jeff Matthews and his organization.
Stephen Franken was important to the investigation. He had quite a bit of knowledge as far as drug trafficking that was taking place down at Fort Myers Beach, and with Jeffrey Matthews' participation in this drug trafficking.
The informant returned with cocaine. After several more buys, DEA agents finally had what they needed to make an arrest. On August 25, 1988, agents secured a felony arrest warrant for Stephen Franken for the sale and distribution of a controlled substance. Once Franken was in custody, agents searched his house. Inside, they found prepackaged cocaine, scales, and cash. In exchange for a shorter sentence, Franken agreed to cooperate with agents. He admitted that murder suspect Jeff Matthews was his cocaine supplier and consented to say so in front of the grand jury. Franken was released on bond until then. As investigators continued to hunt for evidence in their case against Matthews, deputies in nearby Collier County, Florida, responded to a crime scene. On October 2nd, 1988, a surveyor had discovered fully clothed, skeletonized human remains in a rural dump site. It appeared the body had been there for the past several weeks. Though there was no wallet or other ID, detectives did notice a paper bracelet on the victim's wrist, similar to those used by hospitals and nightclubs. Investigators gathered dental records from local families who had recently reported their loved ones as missing. They hoped one of them would match the unknown victims. The dental records, along with the body, were sent to the medical examiner for comparison. He first determined that the victim was a white male in his 20s, killed execution style with 5 .38 caliber bullets to the head. From the body's wrist, the ME removed the paper bracelet. He confirmed it was an admission ban from a nightclub in Fort Myers Beach. Dental records from a missing 22-year-old man last seen leaving the club confirmed that the murder victim was Thomas Sellers. A Collier County Sheriff's detective visited Sellers' father to give him the bad news.
Has he been doing any illegal activities or hanging around anybody lately
The father told the detective that his son had a cocaine problem and believed the young man owed his dealer, Jeff Matthews, $1,000. It was also rumored that his son was last seen leaving the club with a man reputed to be a hitman for the dealer. But once again, investigators were unable to find evidence to corroborate the rumors.
Do you have any pictures of your son?
Agents and detectives' only direct witness to Matthews' operation was Stephen Franken, a low-level dealer arrested months earlier. They hoped his grand jury testimony would be enough to arrest a cocaine supplier suspected of ordering 2 executions. On January 27, 1990, as the DEA and Lee County, Florida sheriffs continued to pursue suspected cocaine dealer and murderer Jeff Matthews, detectives received a call about another possible homicide. At around midnight, a man was unpacking boxes in his new home when he heard the sound of a car squealing towards his house. The vehicle didn't stop until it reached his backyard. Inside, the driver was dead. Lee County Detective Tom Continos was one of the first to arrive at the home in St. Carlos Park.
Initially, I was told it was a motor vehicle accident. There was a dead body in the car. And the closer I looked, the more I realized that he didn't die from a car accident. He died from a bunch of bullet holes.
The driver's license found on the victim identified the dead man as 22-year-old Stephen Franken, the primary witness scheduled to testify against drug kingpin Jeff Matthews at a grand jury hearing just 2 days away. It seemed Matthews was aware that without Franken's testimony, investigators wouldn't have enough evidence to bring an indictment against the cocaine dealer, suspected in 2 killings and now a 3rd. According to DEA Special Agent Dennis Boland,
I think the timing of the murder was because of the timing of the grand jury, the information we received as far as Jeffrey Matthews being involved in other shootings and murders at Fort Myers Beach, and that Stephen Franken had some valuable information as far as Jeffrey Matthews' drug operation.
But now the grand jury would never learn what Franken knew about Matthews. The federal witness was likely dead before he crashed. Detectives decided to search the surrounding area to determine where the shooting had taken place.
Something happened before the guy hit the house, or else he wouldn't have driven through the house. So I walked down the dirt road about several hundred yards, and I found what looked like some attempt at a roadblock.
Large and small branches covered the road, strewn by what must have been a vehicle. To the left side of the site, detectives found several .22 caliber shell casings, the same caliber as the bullets later removed from Stephen Franken's body. Footprints, as well as tire impressions from a separate vehicle, were discovered close by in the loose dirt. Technicians made plaster casts for later comparison should a vehicle or suspect be located. From their placement and Franken's wounds, officers determined that the shooter had fired at the driver's side of the car.
My immediate thoughts were that someone had constructed this roadblock to slow a car down, slow the car down enough where someone can jump out of some brushy area that's along both sides of the road and shoot the person driving that car.
The gunman must have known when Franken left work and the route he traveled home. The victim probably stopped briefly when he saw debris in the road, just long enough for the shooter to take accurate aim. Clinging to life for a few more moments, he likely accelerated down the road and into the house. Though suspected murderer and drug dealer Jeff Matthews was believed responsible, investigators were once again left with no direct evidence tying Matthews to the crime. The fact that Stephen Franken had been a federal witness enabled authorities to broaden the investigation to include the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI. Together, they needed to develop a strategy to snare Jeff Matthews and put an end to the violence. Retired Special Agent Guy Notley was part of the team.
The FBI immediately started working with the Lee County Sheriff's Office and the Drug Enforcement Administration. There was nothing done without telling the other agency involved that what was going on. The FBI did have a lot of manpower that they could put on this matter. They did have tremendous ability for the technical aspect of the investigation.
They knew Matthews was still operating in the area, but the dealer was well insulated. The only way to get to him was through his drug operation and employees. But after the informant Franken was murdered, finding someone else to cooperate would be no easy task.
What made it so difficult was that we didn't have a lot of people come forward and voluntarily supply information on Jeffrey Matthews. Most of the people knew that he was capable of committing murders, and they were intimidated by him.
Agents turned to a man behind bars whom they believed had been an insider in Matthews' organization. Serving a 10-year sentence on concealed weapons charges, the Fort Myers Beach, Florida man was reputed to be one of Matthews' former hitmen. He agreed to tell what he knew about the dealer's drug operation in exchange for a shortened sentence. Just before his arrest, the alleged hitman admitted that Matthews had ordered him to surveil Stephen Franken to learn the man's schedule. With that information, Matthews would be able to silence Franken before he could testify against him. The convict denied knowing who actually pulled the trigger, since he was behind bars before the murder took place. He did tell investigators about another unsolved homicide he claimed that Matthews had committed. He said that one night at the pizza parlor, a contractor was repairing the tiles on the kitchen floor after the restaurant closed.
Try this with sounds.
The hitman had brought over a new silencer for Matthews' gun.
No one hear anything. That thing, see the weight.
It's a heavy gun.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah, how's that? Nice targets.
He claimed the drug lord killed the contractor just to test the silencer. Agents hoped to get Matthews to corroborate the hitman's stories. The convict agreed to call Matthews to set up a recorded meeting. He asked Matthews to come by the prison to drop off some new music tapes. Matthews agreed.
Aye.
Agents would be ready to record the conversation on audio and video, hoping Matthews would incriminate himself.
We received approvals from the U.S. Attorney's Office as well as the jail to install these recorders. Then after we installed everything, he never did show up. Jeffrey Matthews is very elusive, surveillance conscious. He insulated himself pretty well. Even his closest friends didn't know where he was residing at.
Matthews' last suspected victim may have known. But because he was silenced, the alleged murderer remained free and was becoming more desperate. By early 1990, the FBI, DEA, and Florida authorities continued to pursue suspected drug lord and murderer Jeff Matthews. Since 1988, he had been implicated in 4 executions in the Fort Myers Beach area. For Lee County homicide detective Tom Continos and dozens of agents, a lack of hard evidence and verifiable witness statements kept Jeff Matthews just out of reach.
2 years have gone by and I still couldn't get my hands around Jeff Matthews. There was nothing there for me to follow up on. It was dead end after dead end after dead end. All the time I knew Jeff was my #1 suspect, and he was getting stronger and stronger and bolder on his criminal activities on the beach. And it was very frustrating.
On February 12, 1990, a judge agreed that investigators had enough circumstantial evidence against Matthews to search the dealer's pizza place, the likely headquarters for his operation. They served the warrant after hours to avoid endangering customers. From the restaurant, investigators seized documents, phone records, and bank and credit card statements. They also confiscated Matthews' Trans Am. The tire treads were compared to impressions found at one of the murder scenes. The results were negative. Upstairs from the pizza parlor, investigators searched an apartment where Matthews was rumored to sometimes stay with his girlfriend. The couple was not there, nor did the searchers find any cocaine. But they did recover silver-tip .357 cartridges.
22 caliber.
Cash, additional phone records, and most importantly, .22 caliber bullets. The same caliber used in at least 3 of the 4 executions. They were sent to the crime lab to be compared with the spent .22 caliber rounds retrieved from the victims. Tests of the bullet's metallurgic composition did not reveal any matches. It was one more dead end in a grueling case. Though there was no direct evidence linking the alleged drug dealer to the murders, DEA Special Agent Dennis Bolam and his team believed they had enough to indict Jeff Matthews and several associates as part of a continuing criminal enterprise.
We had concerns at that point that by leaving him out on the street, he could commit additional murders. So we felt we had sufficient evidence at that point, and that's the reason why we went and got the indictments to go pick him up.
But Matthews was nowhere to be found. Friends and associates claimed that he had left Fort Myers for parts unknown. His girlfriend, also named in the indictment, agreed to cooperate with investigators to help locate the fugitive. Through a tapped phone line, she made contact with Matthews on his cell.
Hello? Hey, it's me. Hey.
The suspected murderer refused to say where he was.
Don't worry about where I am.
It's kind of hard to get in touch with somebody.
She told him she was worried about the indictments.
If I find out who ratted on us, I'm gonna kill him.
Matthews vowed that he would find out who was talking to authorities and kill them, plain and simple.
Where are you? Yeah.
He hung up seconds later. The next day, a confidential informant gave Lee County homicide detectives a promising tip. They learned that Matthews had rented a car with a borrowed credit card on the night Stephen Franken was murdered.
Here's a picture. Can you tell us a little bit about the case?
An evidence technician compared the tire treads from the rental car to a plaster cast of the tracks collected at the scene of the ambush. They matched. It was the first hard evidence linking Matthews to one of the 4 murders. Unfortunately, it didn't prove that Matthews had driven the rental car to the crime scene, nor that he had pulled the trigger.
We were trying to gather as much information about Matthews as we could. We weren't even successful in finding out where this guy lived. We heard he lived in this big house. We heard he lived in that big house. He drove this car, he drove that car, but he was never there. We were never able to pin him down to where he lived. We only knew that he drove one car, and that's a black Trans Am. He was like, he was everywhere but nowhere.
Then on the night of March 16, 1990, Lee County detectives responded to a call from the home of a Fort Myers Beach fire inspector. A pipe bomb was thrown into his driveway. Filled with .38 caliber bullets, the explosion sent ammunition and shrapnel ripping through the inspector's car and house. It also damaged a storage shed in a neighboring home. No one was injured. The inspector said he had no idea who might be responsible. Detectives asked him for a list of businesses that had failed any recent fire inspections.
You got any problems with anybody?
One name stood out.
Jeff Matthews.
I responded to that scene, learned that this fire inspector conducted a fire inspection of Matthews's restaurant and did not give him a very good write-up as far as the fire conditions of the restaurant. Once I heard that, I said, this is Jeff sending this guy a message.
But if it was Matthews, he had left no trace. All police had to go on was the spotty testimony of a neighbor. The neighbor had heard tires squeal just before the explosion. When he looked outside, he saw a white hatchback race away. It had been too dark to see the license plate. If Matthews had been involved, Detective Continos pondered his change in tactics.
And I remember thinking that was a significant change in Jeff's operation. Before, he was targeting other drug dealers. Now he's targeting government officials, being that he was a Fort Myers Beach fire inspector. That is something different that Jeff was doing.
The detective returned home well after midnight. He tried to unwind, hoping to get some sleep. At about 2 a.m., the sound of an explosion sent him rushing to the window.
That sounded like a transformer blowing up, a car backfiring, fireworks. I mean, there's a number of things that happen in my neighborhood that sound could possibly occur. Phone rings 2 or 3 minutes later. It's one of my associates who was on the DEA task force, says, Tom, the DEA building just got blown up.
The Fort Myers DEA office was moments away from the detective's house.
So I'm the first one on the scene, and I saw the entire DEA building engulfed in flames that are hundreds of feet high. I mean, it was an incredible sight for me.
Investigators immediately suspected fugitive Jeff Matthews. It was the first bombing of a DEA office in U.S. history. 30 firefighters battled the blaze for almost an hour. Dozens of agents, U.S. Marshals, and deputies from 6 neighboring counties were also called into help. FBI Special Agent Guy Notley was among them.
When I arrived on the morning of the bombing, on March 17th, DEA agents informed me that the suspect in this matter was most likely an individual that they indicted 2 days before, Jeffrey Matthews.
If this was the work of Jeff Matthews, the cocaine dealer's violence had escalated to horrific proportions. When law enforcement becomes the target, no one is safe. And Matthews was still on the run. On March 17, 1990, 2 days after a federal grand jury indicted suspected drug lord and murderer Jeff Matthews, the DEA office in Fort Myers Beach, Florida was firebombed. Agents suspected Matthews was responsible, but he was still at large. The FBI and Lee County Detective Tom Continos believed the fugitive was also the prime suspect in another bombing that occurred just hours earlier.
We realized that in all likelihood that the pipe bomb at the fire inspector's house was a diversionary tactic to pull law enforcement resources away from the patrolling area of the DEA building in order for Matthews to firebomb the DEA office.
By dawn, all that remained of the building was a burned-out shell. Investigators now began the task of assessing what was left, how it happened, and where the evidence was buried, hoping to identify the perpetrator. FBI Special Agent Guy Notley called in specialists from headquarters.
We brought in bomb technicians from our laboratory in Washington, D.C., as well as some FBI agents from the Tampa division to conduct investigation. The investigation consisted of going through all the debris that was left at the site, basically by taking it through a shovel and sifting through till we found out what incendiary device that's used.
They determined that the fire was caused by a pipe bomb taped to 2 5-gallon gas cans and tossed through a window. It landed in the office of DEA agent Dennis Bolam. He believed the aim was no coincidence.
My feeling is Jeffrey Matthews was trying to destroy the evidence in the case, and I had the case files on the Jeffrey Matthews case in a file cabinet right near the window, and amazingly the fire and the explosion went right past it, and everything was intact as far as tape recordings and notes and so forth.
Because of the early hour, no one was injured, but damage was estimated at $4 million. Through scattered witness accounts, investigators pieced together a possible scenario for the bombing. No one knew how many people were involved. But neighbors heard only one car and one door open, then closed. Investigators figured those responsible stopped close to the building for a quick hit and run. The bombing had a profound effect on area law enforcement. Agents struggled to deal with the physical reality of the destruction and their emotional reactions.
I was shocked, and then I was angry, and then I was more determined to get him at that point than anything. It's changed my life because I had to have 24-hour guard on my house, as well as the other agents and the prosecutor in the case. I had a wife and 2 small children that I had to worry about, and they had to be protected. And I knew that he was still running around out there, and that there's a possibility that he could do this again.
FBI lab examiners inspected the remnants of the bomb. Nails used as shrapnel were packed into a metal pipe 5 inches in diameter with a unique threading and surrounded with gunpowder. Duct tape held the pipe between 2 5-gallon tanks of gasoline that helped to spread the fire when the bomb went off. 100 DEA agents joined the team, and the 4-person FBI office grew to more than 50. Investigators began tracking down where the bomb materials may have been purchased. Teams of agents canvassed every hardware store and gas station for miles around. The pipe used in the bomb had a unique threat. Agents found the store clerk who had sold this unusual item just days before the explosion. The clerk identified Matthews as the customer who had purchased it. Agents asked dozens of gas station employees if they remembered anyone purchasing gas in 2 5-gallon tanks during the past week or so. One remembered that a man fitting Matthews' description had done so recently. The evidence was mounting against the bomber, but agents still had no idea where he was. They interviewed his friends and associates to determine with whom he'd been in contact.
And how do you know Jeffrey?
One told them that he had written to her, begging her not to believe what she read about him in the newspapers. But she had believed the articles and agreed to have her phone monitored so agents might trace a call from Matthews.
He was elusive. We never knew where he would be at any given time. He was always on the move. So we utilized a trap and trace. We knew that he utilized a cell phone, and we tried to zero in exactly where he was.
With a signed affidavit, agents went to the company that handled Matthews' wireless account. If there was a hit on a cell tower from his phone, authorities would be alerted. They discovered he was still in Florida.
We had even aerial surveillance set up in the Orlando area where we found out where his cell phone was coming from to see if when he made a call that we could get people there quickly in an attempt to apprehend him.
But agents were unable